Calgary. My name is Victoria. I will be helping presenters today. And let me introduce our first presenter is Trudy Curtis. She is a PPDM CEO, the global not-for-profit society focused on building a global community of data professionals, developing best practices and standards for energy data. Trudy is known around the world for her outspoken advocacy of data standards, data as a strategic asset, and data management as a core business function. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. Can you hear me if I'm this far back from the mic?
Yes.
Okay, good enough, because I'm a bit of a wanderer. So well done, everybody, for being here at 9:30 on Saturday morning. Is there anywhere else that you're usually at about this time of day? On Saturday, I'm usually sitting somewhere having a cup of mocha or something like that. But today, I'm going to talk to you about decoupling data and technology, because I think this is really an important topic for us to think about as we get into this era where we're trying to leverage data more and more. So I work for the PPDM Association, and we're not for profit, and we're really focused on data capability. We've got a series of programs. You can find out all about us on the internet. You're welcome to come talk to me after if you want to. But here's the question we ask ourselves all the time. In today's age, when most of the data you get comes to you in digital form, right? How many of you are key entering stuff off handwritten forms these days? Like nobody? Right? The last time I did that was, well, years ago. Why is data so difficult? If it's coming to us in digital form already, why is it that we have to spend time mucking with it, doing things with it, changing it, reformatting it, checking it? Why do we have to do all that? Because that takes a ton of time. How many of you reckon you spend at least 30% of your time trying to find your data and then figure out if it's worth anything? 30%? 50%? 60%? 80%? Is it ridiculous? Right? It makes no sense that we are wasting time, and you know that the person who got the data before you did the same darn thing, and the guy who gets it after you is going to do the same thing again. It's like a never-ending cycle of getting in there and fixing data, fixing data, fixing data, fixing data. A friend of mine says we're forever fixing data instead of fixing it forever. And that's the challenge we have, because data, the way we think about data is maybe not the way it should be. So think about this. Do you all agree with this? A strategic asset has to be managed by experts. If you've got a car, you send it to somebody who knows about cars, right? If you're going to have somebody build a facility, you want a facilities engineer. If you're going to have any kind of an asset, somebody who's an expert has to manage it. So who are the experts who are managing that data and stewarding it? In your company, think about that, okay? If you believe that data is a strategic asset, how many of you believe that data is a strategic asset as opposed to a cost center? Okay, so here's an example of a balance sheet. Where on that balance sheet are you going to put the value of your data? Where is it? How many of you in your companies, when you look at your corporate balance sheet, how many of you see the data recognized as an asset? Almost never, I will tell you, almost never. And here's the thing we got to think about. If you have something in your organization, everything you own is either an asset or it's a liability. And if you cannot prove that it's an asset, then it is by definition a liability. So how many of your organizations go through and attempt to demonstrate empirically that their data is an asset instead of a liability? In fact, if you were honest, how many of you, don't have to show your hands because that might be embarrassing, but how many of you privately think that your data might have some liabilities hidden in it that maybe we don't know about, right? What about that? So we have to be thinking about what it is about our data and where it's going to go. Is it a tangible asset or is it an intangible asset? They both go on the balance sheet, by the way. The fact that our data is not showing up on most companies' balance sheet is a symptom of the way that we think about our data in organizations. We give it lip service, right? Everybody says this. You're like, yeah, they nod. So how many of you do data management? Try to load data analysts. How easy is it for you to get budget and people to do a data quality, data cleanup project? The last time you got that was like what, the 20th of never? Exactly. It's interesting that we give lip service to the idea that data is an asset, but we don't actually follow that up. And there's some consequences to that. So when we think about data assets and how they're got to be managed, data has to be managed for a long time, right? I deal in the energy industry, I deal with a ton of data types that have to be around for many decades. 50 years, 60 years, 100 years, that's not uncommon. So those data assets have to be around. They are used by lots of different stakeholders for lots and lots of different reasons, right? So we have to think about what happens for lots of different purposes, right? To build business capabilities responsibly and intentionally. And that's what we think about as industry right now. We're trying to be responsible and intentional in our data. But I have to look at this and I say, so really? Is it really working like that? Is it really? In your companies? And what are the consequences if it's not? So we talk at PPDM about a data ecosystem, and there's two things at the middle of that data ecosystem, and you'll be astonished to hear that it's the data. It's the dates and the measurements and the values and all that stuff. And happily, we've got ways of kind of consolidating those data things into data objects. But here's what I hear in most organizations, and I am in a lot of organizations around the world every single year. They say, well, every user needs something different from their data, and so it's right that they bend, fold, and mutilate it to the point where it meets their expectations, because that's what they ought to do. But that's not how you treat a strategic asset, isn't it? I mean, what if you had somebody wanted to drive your car, and every time they wanted to drive your car, they're ripping seats out, or they're changing the kind of steering wheel? It makes no sense, right? Strategic assets have to be managed more thoughtfully than that. Then once you've got your data, you have to put it into some kind of a container, right? So you're going to put it in a database or JSON or a graph database or whatever you want to put at it, but it's got to go somewhere. And through its life cycle, that data's got to go in a lot of different containers for a lot of different purposes for a lot of different people, right? The containers aren't all, the data is all. Then we have to be able to move it all around. So how many of you worked on data migrations, data transformation projects where you're moving data from one place to another? And the mechanism by which we do that is always a bit fraught, isn't it? Because you've got junk coming in here and you're trying to kind of sort it out, and the container over here doesn't necessarily quite fit it, or the terminology is not quite right. So you're trying to figure out how to bend, fold, spindle, and mutilate that data to get it to go into this container. And then you're just going to go from this container to something else, to other stakeholders, etc. It's moving around that industry through all these different communication things, right? By people who don't necessarily have the competency and capability to understand the data. I can't even tell you how many people I've been in projects with who said that if an attribute in this data set and there's an attribute in this data set and the names of those attributes are the same, then hey presto, you just put them together, Bob's your uncle, go have dinner. But is that how it works? Right? So we think about this. Technology, we know, has to be very agile. Right? One of the things we struggle with is not being technology ready. Why is it that we're not technology ready? Why is it that we can't adopt new technology as fast as we want to? Data has to be trusted and consistent, reliable, using the FAIR. I'm not sure if FAIR fully covers everything, but this is the cool thing to say now, that your data is fair, that it moves around the industry. They're two different things, but we tend to bind them together in industry in a way that's not necessarily healthy. So I tell people this: think of your data containers in your software as the embankments for the data. The data is what's moving through those embankments, and the data should be clean, it should be accessible, it should remain uncorrupted through the life cycle, but the shape of the embankment should not be allowed to corrupt the data itself. And a lot of times it does, right? So when we think about what those data technology embankments should look like, that's the point of data governance. Okay, data governance, I've seen a lot of data governance program too, and sometimes they get kind of militant, right? Have you ever had a data governance program and they just want to control every aspect of every single thing that you do? Data governance is supposed to help us to steward the data, to protect it from the depredations of technology and time and best intentions and efforts by people to do things. Data governance is supposed to protect and shield the data from all of those different things. So when I think about uncoupling those data and technology standards, we think about data. We've got our data governance programs, our data mastering programs, both strategic and tactical, right? So data governance and data mastering has strategy, and they have tactics that are associated with them. And then there are data management programs, and those are the things that are about the data itself. And I hope that your companies mostly have programs that do that. Technology, by contrast, has to be very agile. And if we tie our data too closely to technology, then we're forever trying to stuff data into the right technology, and we can't keep up because new technology develops super fast, right? How many of you might not know this, but there is in the energy industry, there's a program now called the OSDU, the Open Subsurface Data Universe, that it is a collaboratively built cloud and communication platform for data. And it's being built using open source technologies, many of which are very close to being outdated now. So what happens when they do get updated and you want to change those technologies? If your data is too closely tied in, it's going to take a lot of time, it's going to take a lot of effort, and it's going to be difficult for us to do. So we'd like to see those things very clearly separated. Let's talk about the data and let's talk about the technology, right? Now, they're not linked, but they're associated with each other in some really important ways. But when I'm in these rooms, I see the vendors, and I don't know how many vendors are in it, but you promise your data is going to be amazing. We have a data platform at our company, and if you put your data into our software package, all of your data problems will just magically go away, okay? I've been hearing those promises. I've been in the industry for 42 years, okay? 42 years. And I've heard the same promises year after year after year. If technology was going to solve our data problems, it would already have been solved decades ago, and we wouldn't be having this problem, right? Technology doesn't solve your data problems. Technology gives you a place to put your data. But solving your data problems is a different matter. It's not something that technology can really help you with. And when we have these problems, data is out here. They're not even in the room. And they're saying, but what about the data? Right? Don't worry about that. Well, technology is going to solve all of your data problems, but that's not quite right. So think about this. How many of you have had trouble with the #1 data management tool in the world? Okay? Has this tool ever created a data problem for you? Okay? Has it messed up your numbers? Has it messed up your dates? Has it done things? You have macros and little software programs hidden inside your spreadsheet that give the data context and meaning, that when you export the spreadsheet, all those macros that have the meaning and the context are all left behind, aren't they? Okay? That's not very good, because what builds trust? Trust by users is built in transparency, in clarity, in access to knowing how the data got to be where it is. Because if your users see data here, and those two data elements are not the same, and it doesn't matter how little it is, their trust in your data stores will just evaporate right there. Transparency is really critical. So let's look at a simple example. Excel versus genetics. How many have read this in the newspaper recently? Okay, so here, this one just kills me, okay? So the scientists have been researching the human genome, as you know, and there's a genome called March 1. That would be just an example, okay? So you put March 1 in Excel, and what does it do? It turns it into a date, because Excel knows way better than you what data type you want. You couldn't possibly just want that to be a text string. It's got to be a date, and it changes it. And there are things you can do about it. But these researchers did some study, and they found that up to 1/3 of the research papers that had data associated with them had been corrupted by Excel errors. And they didn't even know. Okay? There's more problems that we have. Excel, unfortunately, it's a great tool, isn't it? Until it's not. It's like the worst tool in the world to manage data with. But people tend not to be aware. Okay? COVID, you all heard about COVID? They were putting their data in Excel. What happened? They didn't realize that there was a space limitation in Excel, and they were stuffing data in and not noticing. It was just leaking out the bottom again. Right? How about the Y2K problem for year 2038? Are we thinking about that and what the impact of that problem is going to be, right? So data containers and software aren't supposed to break data. They're supposed to take care of data. But in fact, if you don't understand what your container is doing and how your container works, it can do a lot of damage. And a lot of times that damage is done without you being even aware that it's happened. Dates are really a big problem, okay? Latitudes and longitudes. How many store latitudes and longitudes in your database? Do y'all use 7 degrees of precision? Right? You got 7 decimal places in there. Do y'all know how small that is? That's like one little grain of sand. Okay, how much sense does it make to mark the location of a facility or a pipeline or a road intersection to 7 degrees of precision? That makes no sense because our data has to be as accurate as reasonable, but we get used to doing things a certain way. So let's talk about this a little bit more. We attenuate our data all the time, right? So our original data looks hopefully like the real world. If we did it right, we captured it right, and we didn't have copy and paste errors or operators out in the field who were not paying very close attention. But then we take that data, we throw a whole bunch of data away, we huck it into a whole bunch of pieces. This piece goes over to finance, this piece goes over to procurement, this bit goes over to my engineers, this bit goes over to, and everybody gets the little pieces that they want, but we don't connect all those pieces. So when you want to do your analytics and start tying together all your data from scheduling and finance and procurement and your engineering data and your scientific data, it's hard to do, isn't it? Because it starts out tied, but we don't leave it tied. So this is a difficulty. Then we obscure its meaning with proprietary formats. How many of you put your data into a proprietary software format? Okay. Now your data is locked up into that format. You've got your own dialects. How many of you in your companies have your own sets of reference lists that you use, that you develop internally, or do you just let people put whatever they want in the reference list? Think about that. Now your dialect isn't the same as everybody else's dialect, but data moves around organizations, it moves between organizations, it moves between an organization and a regulatory agency, it gets into public reports that you're putting available to the SEC, etc. So when we don't have commonality about dialects, we start running into lots of trouble. Okay? Then we don't know where it's from. We don't have that provenance, metadata. We're just now starting to talk more about metadata. We've been talking about this at PPDM for a long time. If your users don't know where the data came from, what's been done to it, why it's been changed, how it's been changed, what it used to be, and have a pathway for fixing that, their trust in data really diminishes. So what you probably already know is that you cannot instruct people to trust your data. As a matter of fact, Shakespeare comes to mind, methinks you doth protest too much. If you tell people to trust their data, what are you trying to hide? Right? People need that transparency. Scientists especially, when you're dealing with people with a scientific background, they're accustomed to the scientific method. If all you give them is the final results, the calculated results or the observed results, and you don't tell them how that data was created, how it was changed, how it was checked, what you validated, etc., they have no mechanism by which to trust the data. And faith is a very difficult commodity to achieve in industry. And once you destroy the faith, once you destroy the trust, it's really hard to get back again. And I've seen, and I love data scientists. You guys are all doing a wonderful job. But people tell me what you do with the best of intentions to data. And it just makes my hair curl. Right? And then you say, well, I don't want anybody else to have this problem. I've got stories that I could tell, but never mind. Just say, I don't want anybody else to have this problem, so I'm just going to go ahead and update the database with the data that you just made up and that has no provenance at all and doesn't match some other data store, and you think that's going to be fine, but it's not. And this is why these are why we're spending a ridiculous amount of time checking and rechecking, verifying, re-verifying, reloading the data again and again and again, because with the best of intentions, we get in there and we do stuff, right? We shouldn't. So data are problems. These all tend to be technology focused. So I work for data organizations, and we have for many years, decades, in fact, worked on data standards. And we fell into the same trap at PPDM until several years ago that we thought that if we were going to create a data standard, what we had to do was create a particular container design for that using a particular technology. And if everybody would use that technology and that design, all of your data problems would go away. Nuh-uh. It doesn't work that way. But if I go around and I look at all the standards that are out, they're in one of these formats, aren't they? So what we're working at PPDM is what happens if we can take all that away. This is our favorite one, Excel, right? Excel has, well, it's got an interesting and checkered past, doesn't it? How many people have a great story about Excel horror story that you'd love to share if we only had time? Anybody, right? So, but that sounds like a kind of a later thing. So, but if we created a technology-centric data standard and you want to unwrap it and get into the actual data part of it, look at all the different wrappers that you have to somehow figure out, and you've got to unwind those wrappers so you can put it into another container. This is one of the reasons why data migrations are really difficult, because you got to figure out all the stuff that is about the data and sort it out from all the stuff that's about the technology and how the technology works, and then you can start working on the data. But we do get really hung up on all of these issues about how it is that we're going to manage our data, particularly performance adjustments, how that container works. Relational containers don't work like non-relational containers, do they? JSON doesn't work like any of those. XML definitely doesn't work like any of those. So if you have a standard and you want to just go get the data, first of all, you got to do is unwind all of that stuff. So we're trying not to do that. So we think about this. What if we could strengthen our data clarity and resiliency and support better competency for data users, for data scientists, data managers, all of our procurement specialists, our scheduling schedulers, our data scientists, our engineers, all of these people? What if we could improve that and build data standards that are not technology-centric? And we talk to people about that, and it makes people's brains almost literally explode. Because they're like, but if I don't tell you what technology is, how will you know what primary key you should use? Right? Well, I'm like, I'm going to assume that the adopter's not stupid. They're going to be able to figure that out. Well, let's talk about what does good data look like, and what kinds of things could we add if we did that, if we could just stop that at the data and leave the technology part of it behind. Technology is really important, but they're two different things. And if you bind them together too soon, we run into all of these technology-centric things, all of these behavior-centric things that run us into a bunch of trouble. So now we start thinking about, how do I preserve my data integrity on one side? Because that's what we want. And then how do I implement in technology? And that how do I implement in technology has to be incredibly flexible, because technology is changing. To answer different kinds of questions, you want to use different kinds of tools, right? And we want our data to be agile enough that you can take that data and put it into this tool with, first of all, not having to unwind it and figure all this stuff out. So there's millions of things that you have to do, and I'm going to run out of time. I could go for hours on this. But these are the kinds of things that we think that we need to solve, on the challenges that we need to think about. Asset identification is something that we don't think about very much. Vocabularies, we need to think a lot more about the importance of semantics, all of these things that we've got papers on our website that describe all these things. But let me give you a quick example. What's an invoice date? Invoice dates are important, right? Everybody kind of knows what an invoice date is. Okay, so here's a process, and I'm going to go and I'm going to buy a car or a washing machine or a facility or whatever it is. And as I go through that process, there's tons of different systems that this has to go through, and it's going to end up in lots of different software applications, and so it's going to end up in your finances, it's going to end up in your invoice, it's going to end up in your scheduling and delivery system. Okay, all of those things probably have something in them called an invoice date. But are they the same invoice date? Is the semantic behind that the same for everybody? And the answer is probably not. And all you have to do really is look online. You can go get these definitions. I did these with a simple Google search. These are definitions for invoice dates. Okay? You can read them. Do you notice that they're not the same? Okay, read this one. If I give you time, you can read this one. This one says, whatever you feel like putting there, just knock yourself out. We don't care. Okay? How does that help you when you're trying to do analytics on data, to do some performance analysis or to see whether or not your efficiencies are there? And everybody's got the invoice date, which is one of your key metrics, and they've got completely different definitions for it, but they didn't write it down because to everybody that's intuitively obvious. Okay, and so you just come with a neural connection to all the people who initially wrote that down. That's all of you guys, right? It must be awfully loud inside your brain as you're listening to all of these people and trying to reconcile all this stuff. This is not playing well with data. When you think everybody's going to think the same way you do, it's not how people work. So here's a question about identity and version management. So you all know about VIN numbers, right? The chairman of my board of directors is an expert on cars, and he expounded to me for about an hour on what these things were. And I won't bother with that. So we got a VIN number, okay? Now, what happens if I replace the engine block, the driver's side door, the chassis or frame? At what point is that a whole new vehicle? In my software system, if I do something and I say, now it's a whole new car, but you don't think that's a new car, you think that's just a new version of the same car, how are you going to get your data systems integrated together? How are you going to tie that together for your data sciences and analytics? There's a question. Because we don't write down how we do our identity and version management in our source systems. We all make assumptions about what's happening. We think it's going to be the way that's intuitively obvious to us, and it's not. And those differences cause a lot of problems when we're trying to tie our data together. So these are things we've got to think about really hard. Okay? So when we talk about data professionals everywhere, from the lowest data entry person to the godlike data scientists and the civilian data scientists, all of you guys, everybody, when we talk about data, what we want to do is it has to support the needs of our users, but it also has to supersede those needs. Because you cannot, in the process of doing your work that you need to do, inadvertently, intentionally, with the best of intentions, whatever it is, damage the data for the next guy, because this data is going from person to person, process to process. You are not the be-all and end-all. I'm sorry to disappoint you, okay? Data doesn't end with you. It didn't begin with you. It's going to go on. Many people will continue to use and depend on that data, and if we mess it up, all we do is make things worse for everybody else. So we think at PPDM about what good data should look like and what data professionals should know about that data to make sure that we're stewarding it in a healthy way for data capability, not just for me. This is really the me generation, right? It's not about you. The data has to flow through a lot more people. So I'm advocating a lot more thought. And that's what data governance is about. It's thinking about this whole process. We work on all this stuff at PPDM all the time. We have developed a methodology for separating data from technology. And when our data managers or data scientists stop crying in their soup because it's not embedded in their favorite technology, this can work. But it's about thinking beyond you. It's about thinking about how am I making life better for the person behind you. We will have solved our problems when you can take data and start using it with confidence right away. And you know that all the people who are coming behind you 20 years, 30 years from now, people who aren't even born yet, will also be able to use that data and trust it and leverage it effectively using whatever technology is around at that particular time. So these are the programs we do. I'm not going to get into them because I think I'm now 30 seconds. I rant. Did you notice I kind of rant? But this stuff really matters. And as data scientists, you are in a position to make this better for everybody. So I'm advocating. Any questions, comments? I'll turn it over back to you then.